Hello and welcome, delegates. In the next 90 minutes, we will be looking at how to implement the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework early, efficiently. We are all part of the solution and the solutions. So what you will see in this session is collective action in action. In just a couple of days, negotiations will take place to really look at the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, negotiate what is in that framework. And then later on this year in Kunming, China, that framework will be adopted. I want you to think of this event as an energizer. And I am Femi Oke, your moderator for today's session.
Biodiversity is the foundation of our lives, our livelihoods, and our cultures. But we are losing the diversity of life at an unprecedented rate. To stop this loss, we need to transform our world. We need a blueprint, direction, goals. The Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework is our chance to restore our Earth and secure a fairer, healthier future. To be adopted at UN Biodiversity COP15, the framework must drive urgent action over the next 10 years and set us on track to live in harmony with nature. From individuals, to businesses, to governments around the world, everyone has a role to play in its implementation. Humanity stands at a crossroads. The Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework is critical for all life on Earth. To learn more about the framework, visit cbd.int/post2020.
Coming up, we have an impressive lineup of speakers. I'm going to preview them. Speakers, please put on your cameras. Please put on your microphones momentarily so we can see the collective action. Who is going to be sharing their thoughts, their insights, their experiences. So you can see them all right now on camera. You'll be hearing more from them in a moment. So our session today is doing a couple of things. We are working out how to put words into action. Yes, we're going to be talking a lot, but also talking about action. We're also going to be working out how to support implementation. That is so critical when we get to that stage, so we can do it early, hit the ground running. Your questions, your comments, oh my goodness, we really want them. I want this to be a back and forth. This is collective action, so that means you delegates are part of this as well. See the question box, put your questions, even your thoughts, your comments in that question box. Those questions will get to me and I will share them with our speakers. Thank you for doing that. Throughout the program, there will be keynote speakers as well, some special highlighted speakers. And we're going to start, we're setting the bar high. So this is why that we have got David Cooper, who's the Deputy Executive Secretary of the CBD. He is going to set the standard. David, welcome.
Thank you very much, Femi, and Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. It's my real pleasure to welcome you to this flagship event at the resumed 5th session of the United Nations Environment Assembly. And on behalf of Elizabeth Maremma, the Executive Secretary of the Convention, and all my colleagues at the Secretariat, let me express my appreciation, our appreciation, to all the speakers who have generously agreed to enliven our discussions today, and to all the participants who have joined us virtually and on site in Nairobi. Although the challenges of the pandemic are still with us, I'm encouraged to see this resumed session at UNEA 5, forging ahead with its work to highlight the pivotal role nature plays in our lives and in social, economic, and environmentally sustainable development. This meeting will certainly provide inspiration to the global biodiversity community as we all continue our efforts to put nature on a path to recovery by 2030 and to adopt an ambitious post-2020 global biodiversity framework at the upcoming second part of the CBD COP15 later this year. The new framework aims to realize the 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature, and its success will require the swift implementation of actions, transformative actions. This flagship event today will highlight how actors across government and across society can contribute to ensuring early, effective and inclusive implementation of the post-2020 framework once it is adopted in Kunming. We hope to underscore the importance of collective action to improve biodiversity conservation, sustainable use and benefit sharing, and developing more integrated approaches to support that early implementation that we need. To bring the new framework to life, we must work urgently to foster synergies and enhance our collaboration across all sectors. We've therefore called upon the full range of actors, from national governments, the UN system, business and the financial sector, Indigenous peoples and local communities and civil society, to discuss the multi-stakeholder action and partnerships needed to advance early action. By emphasizing the need to collaborate on and scale up solutions that ensure the stability of our societies and economies, this event can help build the political momentum that we need for the upcoming negotiations in Geneva later this month and at COP15 in Kunming. Ladies and gentlemen, let us be clear. It's this decade that we need to act. Our actions this decade will determine the future of humanity. The IPCC report issued yesterday again highlights this urgency. The post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework will set humanity's course on nature for the rest of this decade and therefore beyond. With a concerted and broad-based effort across whole of government and the whole of society, we can deliver on the ambitious vision of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework and secure a resilient planet for people and for nature. I thank you and wish you all the best in these discussions.
Thank you so much, David. Some hashtags for you. Hello, delegates. Thanks for joining us today. Hashtag UNEA, hashtag biodiversity, hashtag post-2020. Okay, so now you are ready to spread the words, the support, the implementation that we are going to be sharing today with the rest of the world online and in social. Our next special guest speaker has been talking about how to protect the earth, how to be better stewards of the earth for more than 3 decades. She has a lot of experience in poking us, prompting us, encouraging us, yelling at us in productive ways. So it is my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Seven Cullis Suzuki.
Thank you so much, Femi, and thank you, everyone. Hello, my fellow human beings. My name is Severin Cullis Suzuki, and I've been an environmentalist since I was a child. And today I come to you as Executive Director of the David Suzuki Foundation. I come to you from the homelands of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples, who have stewarded the lands and waters here on the west coast of Canada for thousands of years. I'm truly honored to be here speaking to you all who are working so hard for our planet. We come here today from all corners of the globe, yet we face a shared destiny. 2 years ago, COVID brought us together as all our lives were changed by the global pandemic. COVID had some humbling teachings for humanity. It reminded us of the truths that we have ignored, that nature is the true bottom line, that we need science and data to get us through, that we are all interconnected, that we need radical empathy in order to survive, And finally, and most incredibly and importantly, each of our actions matter. Whether we wash our hands, whether we wear a mask, whether we get vaccinated, those have implications. And while the degree to which people experienced the pain of the pandemic varied greatly, all humanity was affected by this crisis. The whole world had a moment of understanding of these truths. And these lessons we have just learned are absolutely key for us to be able to meet our environmental crisis. We need to keep those lessons top of our minds and organizations and in our societies, because the pull towards division and breakdown is strong. Today, war is reverberating through our interconnected world. War in the 21st century should be an anachronism. War, such a waste of everything, of life, of resources, and of time. And I see in our country, Canada, there are already war profiteers who are jockeying into position to take advantage and take us back into a fossil fuel dependent world. We can't afford this. We can't afford division. We can't afford to be distracted from the real conflict of our species, our war with our own life support systems of this planet. Yesterday, the doctors of our atmosphere, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, released another report, and it is stark. Our ecosystems, our life support systems have begun to break down. The UN Secretary General called the report an atlas of human suffering and a damning indictment of a failed climate leadership. And our children have to be right in there fighting too. Here in my country, a group of youth litigants have challenged our country in the courts, arguing that their rights in our Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms are being violated by our government's inaction on climate change. Youth taking their governments to court for lack of action is happening all over the world. Our children are starting to pay right now. 30 years ago this year, the world convened in Rio de Janeiro for the Earth Summit in 1992. I was 12 years old. We committed to the Rio Declaration, to Agenda 21, the Statement of Forest Principles, the Convention on Biodiversity, the UNFCCC. Imagine if we had acted on those promises. So today, the task at hand is, how do we ensure that our promises are not empty? We know that we cannot afford inequity anymore. Global inequity and injustice are at the root of our destructive relationship with nature, and pervasive loss of biodiversity and aggravation of climate crisis. Injustice and addressing injustice must be baked into every solution that we create. Indigenous peoples, they have the best track record for land stewardship and understanding local systems. They know how to survive massive ecological and social change. They've been doing it for the last few hundred years of colonization. Indigenous people must be supported to be leaders for navigating our pathway through this ecological bottleneck. If you had told me in 2019 that the governments of the world would move billions to meet an existential crisis, that they would work across party lines and make tough decisions following science, that we would all change our lifestyles profoundly to do our part to meet the crisis, I would not have believed you. And yet here we are. We have just proven to ourselves that we can meet an existential crisis. We can meet an emergency. And now we have to apply that to our global ecological crisis, to our crisis in biodiversity. We must use what we've just learned to meet our greatest challenge. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Seren. So this next section is all about putting words into action. What will our speakers advise us to do? We start with Bettina Hoffman, who ironically has a very long title, so full of words, Bettina. I will try and do it justice. Bettina is the Parliamentary State Secretary in the Federal Ministry for the Environment, Nature Conservation, Nuclear Safety and Consumer Protection of Germany. I would love to see her business card, but right now I'm really looking forward to what she has to share with us. Bettina Hoffman, over to you.
Thank you, Ms. Fimi-Oak. Ladies and gentlemen, the success of the new post-2020 goal biodiversity framework depends on its implementation. This is why the focus of today's panel, putting words into action, is so important. It's true, the clock is ticking. We must stop global loss in biodiversity and put the international community on a new path that requires an ambitious new biodiversity framework. In my view, an ambitious new global biodiversity framework has two pillars. The first pillar is clear. It is to set ambitious targets. These targets must address the causes of biodiversity loss that the IPBES report identified. This will mean that the global framework has to directly address economic sectors and hold them accountable. However, targets alone are not enough. This is why I'm working for a strong implementation regime as a second pillar. This must include effective mechanisms for monitoring, reporting, and review. We need to fine-tune the negotiation text in this area. It is important that multilateral institutions focus on implementing the global biodiversity framework. This is why I'm pleased about the involvement of international organizations such as UNEP, IUCN, FAO, and the multilateral environmental conventions like the Ramsar Convention and CITES. Germany supports partner country projects that benefit biodiversity and climate action under its International Climate Initiative. These projects increase the effectiveness of governments, civil society, and the private sector in partner countries using investments, policy advice, capacity building, technology transfer, and research cooperation. Biodiversity is also an important focus on the German G7 presidency. We want to put momentum behind an ambitious global framework and send a signal for swift implementation of the global targets. And at the national level, the new German government has prepared plans to usher in a decade of nature restoration and counteract biodiversity loss. I want to mention a few highlights. Protecting nature and enhancing its natural functions makes a direct contribution to climate change mitigation. This is the starting point of our action program on nature-based solutions. We want to capitalize on the synergies between nature conservation and climate action and tackle the twin crisis with an integrated approach. Before Easter, we plan to present a key issue paper containing the first immediate measures. The focus is on peatlands, floodplains, forests, grasslands, marine and coastal ecosystems. We will also review a peatland protection strategy for any needed changes and work for a cabinet decision in this area in the first half of the year. In addition, we want to think about marine conservation more broadly and improve the status of the seas. With a coherent national marine strategy, we want to bring conservation and sustainable use into balance with each other. We will update our national biodiversity strategy. It will be aligned with the new global biodiversity framework and summarize the various targets and measures for implementing it in Germany. In addition, a strong implementation regime, improved financing for nature conservation is absolutely crucial so that we can implement measures necessary to fulfill our biodiversity goals.
Bettina, what's the most important last point that you want to make? Did you get to the very last point that you wanted to make about actions, turning words turning into actions? Yes.
We want to fulfill national, but also European and international biodiversity goals.
Thank you so much, Bettina Hoffmann. I really appreciate you. We have so many speakers for you that we have to keep moving along. I want to bring in some of the thoughts and questions. I see your questions. Thank you. One of your questions was about, is this available, our event available in French? Unfortunately not, but do check to see what platform you're on. There may be closed captions and you may be able to choose French in the closed captions or later if it is able to go on YouTube. So apologies about that. The other questions about financing, we are getting to them later in the program. I will come back to you in just a moment. So where to next? I'm going to bring in Adrian Pena, Minister of Environment of Uruguay. He joins us now. via video.
El mundo se apresta a definir un nuevo marco para la biodiversidad post-2020 en un momento donde todas las evaluaciones coinciden en que los esfuerzos a nivel global para revertir la pérdida de diversidad biológica y promover su uso sostenible han sido significativos, pero no suficientes. Uruguay no escapa a esta situación, sin embargo, en los últimos años nuestro país ha renovado su compromiso con la conservación de la diversidad biológica. Ha creado un Ministerio de Ambiente y dentro de él ha jerarquizado la gestión de la biodiversidad a través de la creación de una Dirección Nacional de Biodiversidad y Servicios Ecosistémicos. Nos encontramos dando los pasos para comenzar la actualización de la Estrategia Nacional de Biodiversidad y la implementación de un proyecto multifocal con el objetivo de consolidar las políticas de conservación y a la vez desarrollar estrategias y acciones de restauración de ecosistemas y tierras degradadas. Pero estas estrategias deben ser llevadas a la práctica y esto requiere de recursos financieros. La valorización de servicios ecosistémicos es clave para que la sociedad pueda destinar recursos a la implementación de estrategias para la conservación de la biodiversidad. La incorporación de la visión transformadora hacia un marco post-2020 debemos darla entre los gobiernos en una discusión abierta con todos los actores. Hemos culminado exitosamente un proyecto co-ejecutado con organizaciones de la sociedad civil, cuyo principal objetivo ha sido el promover y fortalecer las sinergias entre las 3 convenciones de Río, resaltando la importancia de trabajar en las metas nacionales y globales de estas convenciones de forma conjunta. La conservación de la biodiversidad es clave en la adaptación y mitigación del cambio climático y la urgencia de atender los temas climáticos no debe hacernos perder de vista que necesitamos la biodiversidad como parte de la solución. Recientemente se ha aprobado el Plan Nacional para el Fomento de la Producción con Bases Agroecológicas, promoviendo sistemas alimentarios más sostenibles y eficientes en el uso de la biodiversidad y los recursos naturales. Además, en cumplimiento con el proyecto de Nagoya, hemos fortalecido los instrumentos para regular el acceso a los recursos genéticos y el reparto equitativo de sus beneficios. También hemos avanzado en acciones de valorización de nuestro principal ecosistema, los pastizales templados, sustento de la producción ganadera que se desarrolla en Uruguay sobre bases sostenibles, para la que estamos evaluando su huella con el fin de mejorar más aún el desempeño ambiental de esta actividad. Buena parte de la biodiversidad está amenazada por la transformación de ecosistemas para la agricultura. Una de las formas para resolver las necesidades de financiamiento global para la biodiversidad es que los países definan marcos arancelarios diferenciales que incentiven alternativas de producción compatibles con la conservación de la biodiversidad. Esto permite incorporar al sector privado en la conservación, favoreciendo la transferencia de valor desde los consumidores hacia la producción sustentable. Por último, queremos señalar que Uruguay apoya el aumento de ambición para alcanzar un 30% de la superficie global protegida al 2030 y nos comprometemos, en el marco de nuestras posibilidades, a desarrollar nuestro mayor esfuerzo para aumentar la superficie protegida a nivel nacional bajo el Sistema Nacional de Áreas Protegidas u otras medidas de conservación basadas en áreas, incluyendo el océano y los ecosistemas marinos. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much indeed, Minister. If you've just joined us, we are talking about how to implement the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework fast, early, efficiently, and inclusively. A business perspective is going to be critical to try and achieve all of those 3 aims. I'm delighted to introduce to you, Mr. Sads Savanwala. He's the Chief Impact Officer of Infarm. What impact will he have on our event? Let's find out. Hello, Sads, welcome.
Thank you, Femi, and thank you everyone for the opportunity to be here. We are a vertical farming company, which was founded 8 years ago in Berlin, and we're now in 11 countries. So the consequences of climate change, biodiversity loss, and depletion of natural resources are terrifying for us all. We've seen the IPBES reports, the IPCC report from yesterday, and that each one is bleaker than the next one. So let's contextualize this with food and people. The world population will grow to 10 billion by 2050, of which 70% will be urban. Agriculture accounts for 1/3 of all emissions and is the primary driver of biodiversity depletion. If we want to feed our populations in the same way as we've done in the past, we need the resources of an entire another planet in terms of natural resources, and we don't have one. So fundamentally, we need to transform our current food systems to reliably feed this growing population, withstand climate change shocks, and in a world of diminishing natural resources and, of course, vulnerable supply chains. So essentially, we need to decouple ecosystem destruction from food production, and we believe technology plays a very big role here. Vertical farming, which is what we do at Infarm, is one technology solution that is available and is now putting actively words into action. It is a nature positive business model. So through the use of technology, we grow in vertical farms close to urban centers, and therefore it has much less travel time and distance to not only to the supermarket, but to from farm to fork, so to speak. It uses a very small amount of land, which is only about 5% of the land compared to conventional farming for the same crop, which means that we are talking about conserving land, leaving that for biodiversity to flourish. In terms of water, which is one of the key things that was highlighted in yesterday's IPCC report, that water is a big stress point, and there's going to be 3 billion people who are going to feel that water stress very soon. And we are talking about using 5% of the current of comparable water in terms of what open farming uses. So we use 95% less water, to put it simply. There's no chemical pesticides, so there's a positive health effect. And there's no agricultural runoff because these are closed systems and there's no pesticides. So you can see both, this is healthy for both planet and for people. And on carbon, it's an energy intensive industry, and we are therefore driving the green energy take-up and renewable energy take-up as we look to bring down emissions. There's also a lot of consumer demand around brands doing the right thing, companies doing the right thing from a social point of view and an environment point of view, and there's enough studies around that. So there are 3 actions that I just wanted to highlight. So one is for businesses to set, measure, and report actionable science-based targets and on climate and biodiversity based on the post-2020 framework. The Science-Based Targets Network, for example, is currently developing a comprehensive guidance for target setting. The second is partner for businesses, partner with multilateral national actors and NGOs to drive these solutions. And the third one is for businesses to think afresh, to adopt the triple bottom line principle,
Right,
of people, planet, and profits. And I'm glad to say that Infarm is one of them.
thank you. Thank you so much. Give us a 1, 2, and 3 to make it very straightforward for the direction we need to go into. Thank you so much, Sads. You may remember just a little bit earlier on, Seven was talking about how Indigenous people were the original stewards of the earth. It's my pleasure to bring in Abigail Kitmer. Abigail is the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Program Coordinator of Teba Foundation. Abigail, hello, welcome.
Thank you, Femi. Maptangjan agos unsi kayo amin. That's a greeting from my homeland. And I'm very glad to be in this space with you all. And while we're on the discussion on the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, right now we are moving at the final stages of the discussion of the framework. But for those of us on the ground, our actions don't end at the adoption of the framework. And so I think one thing that I think is very important for the implementation is the recognition that people do have positive contributions to nature, and that we do have relational and reciprocal relationships to nature. So what does this mean in terms of the implementation? This means that we should build on the actions of peoples that have gone before us. And for us Indigenous peoples, this means building on and continuing on the work that our ancestors has done in protecting our territories and resources, and making sure that the next generations would also experience what we experience now living in nature, and that they should also be able to learn the knowledge to protect what we have right now. So this also means that therefore supporting local collective actions on the ground by Indigenous peoples, by women, by youth, by everyone should be at the fore of the framework. This means direct support, financial resources to support plans and activities and of Indigenous peoples for our territories. And we have been doing a lot and been proactively engaging with different partners from our national governments to local governments to other agencies in doing so. So our elders have been leading and governing our communities in protecting our territories. Women have been very active in preserving our agro-biodiversity in relation to indigenous food systems, as the previous speaker has also referenced. Youth are very active in passing on and revitalizing traditional knowledge that could contribute to effective decision making. So these are the activities and what we could support in the implementation of the framework. And these are the entry points where we can all support each other for the effective fulfillment of the vision, living in harmony with nature. So another thing that I guess I also wanted to add that, yes, sorry.
I've got a question for you. I wonder if I could ask the question so that you can also interact with our audience. This one comes from Laurie Johnston.
Sure.
And Laurie asks about Indigenous peoples governments that the CBD Secretariat negotiated with for commitments to the GBF. And I'm wondering how the CBD found you. Did you find them or did you find the CBD? How did that relationship work?
Well, since the Rio started, since the CBD was born out of the Rio discussions. Well, I wasn't born yet during that time, but I understand that it was this discussion for all, and that representatives from Indigenous peoples all around the world were also part of that discussion, and it is through there that they lobbied very hard and for the inclusion of Indigenous peoples in these important discussions in relation to nature.
Thank you.
I hope that answers the question.
It does, and for me, it's just like obvious. Of course, you have to include Indigenous peoples because they bring so much knowledge to us, but that's not always the case. I hear you saying the lobbying. Something else that you mentioned, Abigail. Abigail, thank you so much. Did you notice how Abigail was speaking? She's talking about how you turn words into action, and she was beaming the whole time. The passion jumps off the screen. Let me just bring in Kevin Lanzalo. He's the founder and coordinator of Global Youth Biodiversity Network in Kenya. Kevin, Abigail was talking about youth, young people. I know you're going to build on that. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Femi, ladies and gentlemen, for this opportunity. My name is Kevin Lanzalo. I am the co-founder of the Kenyan Youth Biodiversity Network, and just speaking from where Abigail left, it's indeed important to bring the voices of those who have been historically sidelined into the discussions of the post-2020, including the voices of Indigenous young people and young people in general. I come from a country where young people form the majority of the population. We're talking about over 70% of the population being under the age of 30. That alone is a justification for the urgent need to include these people, not only in the country's positions, but in the regional development and conservation frameworks. Because if those frameworks sideline the youth, who are the majority, then it's obvious that the majority of the population is being left out of the discussion. As young people, we want meaningful engagement that goes beyond tokenism and face appearances to that which appreciates young people as key stakeholders that should be brought into the ideation, implementation, and the monitoring of such frameworks. The Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework provides a unique opportunity for the world to learn from the failures of the frameworks that preceded that, including the Aichi targets, that we can move forward as a holistic society that works together, that supports the needs of young people, including solving some of the pressing challenges like unemployment, the need to divest from, for example, fossil fuels into progressive industries that create green employment for the people, that enhance the safety of the planet, and that ensure that young people take on the mantle as the custodians of conservation for today and the coming days. We need a right-based approach that appreciates the fact that we cannot dismantle nature rights from human rights. These are rights that should be protected together. And as young people, we want structures that agree to bring us in as equals, structures that do not sideline us based on the fact that we are youth, and structures that appreciate that as young people, we have something to bring on board. Over the last few years, we have seen increased numbers of young people talking about the need for them to be included in conservation, for the need for them to be empowered, for their capacity to be enhanced so that they can equally contribute to policy frameworks, and the need for scaling up the initiatives that they have started on the grassroots. Now, more than ever, we have youth networks like the Global Youth Biodiversity Network, which are showcasing how young people are organizing themselves. Young people are forming movements, they are forming grassroots organizations, they are forming networks. So the structure to engage young people is there. Young people are showing, they are proving that they are organized enough and they are ready to be engaged. But the world leaders seem not to be looking that way. For us to realize the ambition, the shared vision of living in harmony with nature, we have to see how to utilize such opportunities that young people have created to bring them into this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The Global Biodiversity Framework will be adopted later this year in Kunming, China. So it seems appropriate that we have China's Ministry of Ecology and Environment joining us with our second keynote address. Minister Huang Jie.
尊敬的各位嘉宾、女士们、先生们，大家好！很高兴作为 COP15 主席出席本次会议。生物多样性是人类赖以生存和发展的基础。2020年后，全球生物多样性框架将作为 COP15 的重要标志性成果，为未来10年乃至更长一个时期全球生物多样性治理描绘蓝图。去年10月COP15 第1阶段会议在中国昆明成功举办，9位缔约方国家元首和联合国秘书长出席了领导人峰会，100多位部长级代表参加了部长级会议。会议通过了昆明宣言，体现了各国采取行动，扭转当前生物多样性丧失的趋势，并确保最迟在2030年使生物多样性走向恢复之路的决心和意愿，为后续框架磋商奠定了坚实的政治基础。在 COP15 第1阶段会议上，中国国家主席习近平宣布率先出资15亿元人民币，成立昆明生物多样性基金，支持发展中国家生物多样性保护事业。希望各方加入我们的行动，为全球生物多样性保护和框架执行贡献力量。当前，框架谈判正处于关键时期。框架工作组第3次会议即将在瑞士日内瓦赴会， 这可能是 COP15 之前唯一的面对面磋商。我们要充分把握好这次机会，努力弥合分歧，扩大共识，完成包括框架谈判在内的各项议程，为 COP15 第2阶段会议顺利召开和成果达成奠定基础。女士们、先生们，蓝图美好，贵在执行。框架制定应充分借鉴爱之目标实践的经验教训，兼顾雄心、务实和平衡，照顾各国的国情和发展水平的差异，加强执行保障。我呼吁各方展示灵活，以最大努力为框架制定凝聚国际社会共识，并在 COP15 第2阶段会议审议通过后，全面有效执行框架。我呼吁各国政府积极将国际共识转化为具体行动，及时更新国家战略与行动计划，完善生物多样性相关政策法规，为生物多样性保护和可持续利用调动更多的资源，加强生物多样性、气候变化、污染治理、减少贫困等可持续发展议题的协同治理。我呼吁国际组织、私营部门、金融机构、土著和地方社区、妇女、青年、社会组织、个人等所有利益攸关方，积极加入从沙姆沙伊河到昆明人与自然行动议程，为生物多样性作出承诺，转变生产生活方式，主动参与生物多样性保护恢复行动，共建地球生命共同体。最后预祝本次会议取得圆满成功，谢谢大家。
Thank you so much, Minister Huang Jie. If you were listening to this session, you would have heard Minister Huang Jie in his mother tongue. But if you go to the CBD website, just a little bit later after this event, you'll be able to see the subtitles in English. Thank you for bearing with us for those few minutes. We are moving on with our theme. We're talking about GBF, implementing it this year, early, efficiently, inclusively, obviously, okay. But what do we need to support that implementation? What's needed? Partnerships, new partnerships coming together, global diversity, funding as well. So many questions fall into this. So how do we support the GBF being implemented as quickly as possible? Those questions, I'm going to start with those questions with Neville Ash. Hi, Neville. A lot of questions for you to answer. Director of the UN Environment World Conservation Monitoring Centre, UNEP WCMC. Hello, Neville. What do you want to share?
Thank you, Femi, and good evening to everyone in Nairobi and to all online. So the development of the Global Biodiversity Framework has been a longer than expected journey and of course still has its negotiations ahead of it. But during the last few years of discussions, we've heard a lot about ambition. And ambition is clearly needed across the entire framework and most importantly on the political will and resources required for its urgent implementation. But selective ambition is not high ambition, and we've had ambitions before. The challenge is we've been aspiring to ambitious outcomes for nature without delivering on the actions required to achieve them. If we're to bend the curve on the loss of nature and ensure the benefits from nature for people, then this requires early and urgent action to address the causes of biodiversity loss. If we are to ensure we're on a pathway to the 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature and any milestones in the framework, then early action is needed across all targets in the framework, across society and by whole of government. So given this action is so important, we must surely also strengthen our understanding of the extent of action being taken. If we don't have a stronger understanding of the action being taken and the outcomes achieved from that action, how do we know if it's sufficient? The current lack of transparency and accountability on commitments made, resources committed, actions taken, and the outcomes achieved is a major barrier to progress and means we are partially sighted in our efforts to secure a future for nature and people. But this can be overcome. A better understanding of collective national ambitions and collective progress through global goals towards global goals and targets would be achieved through greater coherence between the global framework and national planning, monitoring and reporting. And this would provide clarity on progress at the national level and with the opportunity to feed this information into global stocktakes of both collective ambition and collective progress. Enable both tracking progress, including early actions taken, but also to identify areas and issues where additional efforts and resources are needed to make progress. The science is clear on the urgency and the need for early and inclusive action, and we have in front of us the remaining part of a last chance decade to address the biodiversity crisis. I'm sure we'll hear more about the important GF support with UNEP and UNDP from our next speaker to support this. But also last year, the wider UN system agreed and committed our strengthened support to address biodiversity loss. Through the UN Common Approach to Biodiversity, the UN system expressed a shared recognition of the urgency to act and a commitment to mainstream biodiversity across strategies, policies and programs of the UN system in support of member states' ambitions on biodiversity. And by leveraging the expertise, collaboration and convening of the United Nations, the UN Common Approach will contribute to outcomes across all three pillars of the UN system: peace and security, human rights and development, in recognition of the core and cross-cutting concern on biodiversity from the UN system. So yes, the UN Biodiversity Conference in Kunming has been much delayed. The success of the conference will depend on rapid progress in this month's negotiations in Geneva, but this delay has driven a greater sense of urgency for action and for the transparency required to know if we're making progress. And if not, then to scale up both ambition and urgent action required to secure the future we want for nature and people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Neville. I'm going to bring in Carlos Manuel Rodriguez right now. He's the CEO and chairperson of the Global Environment Facility, also known as GEF. We have so many questions, Carlos, about financing and the GBF. I'm really intrigued as to how you feel that GEF can support this new global biodiversity framework. Good to have you. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Femi. It's such a pleasure to be here with you and everybody who's joining us in UNEA. So if we pollute our air, water, and soil that we depend on, and if we destroy biodiversity, natural ecosystems who give us environmental services, there is no money in the planet that will help us to survive these global crisis induced by human beings. So we need to understand that that at the end of the day, what we have, Femi, is a major challenge of political incoherence and political inconsistency. You know, we humans, the global political system is not like a single cell organism. On the contrary, it responds to many different incentives and circumstances. And the one big challenge that we have in front of us is to generate more political consistency and coherence as we look forward into the implementation of the new CBD framework. This means that governments in the implementation of this new framework should create the incentives and the policies by which all public and private investments are aligned with a new CBD framework. And this is extremely important. Recent reports tell us that we are investing 100 times more financial resources in activities that destroy nature and contribute to climate change than what we invest in protecting nature. So it's not a matter of mobilizing more finance that what will at the end of the day will help us. On the contrary, it's generating more political consistency and coherence. Political coherence means that the full alignment of national development policies. It's not just the Minister of Environment promoting good, sound environmental policies and regulations. It's the whole government really aligned with this and creating the right incentives and policies so the private and the public sector are totally aligned with these goals and targets of protecting nature and using nature as a driver for growth and sustainability. So in a nutshell, what we need is to invest in those political processes that can help us overcome the very specific issues related to the negative impacts of our consumption and production pattern. Thank you so much, Femi.
Thank you, Carlos. I want to ask you a question, if I may. This comes from the audience, so this is on behalf of the audience. And this is really from Jeff's perspective. How will the GBF govern financing for sustainable development mechanisms? That should really be in all financing projects, shouldn't it? The idea that it should be sustainable. Carlos, go ahead.
Well, yes, indeed, the Jeff plays a major role in being the largest, by far, multilateral fund to implement the mandates and the goals and targets from all the multilateral environmental agreements, which the CBD is in the center of it. So it's the financial mechanism to do that. Nevertheless, we can even make the Jeff budget 2 or 3 or 4 times bigger. That will never be enough money to narrow the global financial gap. The global financial gap and being on track with the new framework requires a full political alignment of all sectors. So if you stop destroying nature, the cost of protecting nature will decrease dramatically, and we will be on track to be nature positive by 2030.
Thank you, Carlos. I'm hoping you'll be able to stick around for the next 30, maybe 40 minutes, because I'm bringing back all of the speakers so that we can actually talk to each other, bring in some of the audience questions, and have a longer time to talk about some of the most important points of implementation of the GBF. But for now, Carlos, thank you so much. I'm going to go now to it's always a pleasure having you. I'm going to go now to Lord Goldsmith. He's the Minister for Pacific and Environment in the UK. Lord Goldsmith, it's good to have you. Welcome.
It's a pleasure to say a few words. At COP26 in Glasgow, the UK presidency sought to bring nature from the margins of the conversation on climate change into the heart of our collective response. And with the help of some of the world's most nature-rich countries, we were able to do so. 141 countries representing 90% of the world's forest cover, committed to halting and reversing forest loss and land degradation by the end of this decade. That declaration is reinforced by unprecedented public, private, and philanthropic finance amounting to nearly $20 billion, and by public commitments from the world's biggest buyers of agricultural commodities, the main multilateral development banks, and financial institutions in command of trillions of dollars to align purchasing and portfolios, not only with the Paris goals, but with nature as well. We secured nearly $2 billion to help indigenous people and local communities defend their forests. And one indigenous leader at COP said, "We've protected 80% of the world's forest biodiversity without any support at all. Can you imagine what we'll do with support?" The UK remains president of COP until we hand over to Egypt towards the end of this year. And our principal role is to ramp up these commitments and inject scrutiny and accountability at every level to ensure they're honoured in full. We're committed to making sure that nature is properly recognised as the golden thread running through all 3 Rio conventions, and to aligning them so that they add up to more than the sum of their parts. And so when the world comes together at CBD COP15 in Kunming, the new post-2020 global biodiversity framework that we agree there must put nature back on a road to recovery. We need to secure those targets to protect at least 30% of the world's land and ocean by 2030, and to see ecosystems restored, species population sizes recovering, and extinctions halted by 2050. And it has to include strengthened reporting and review mechanisms that will hold parties to account for the commitments that are made, and a recognition of the clear role of Indigenous peoples and local communities in this global endeavour. But to secure this framework, we must also demonstrate our collective willingness and ability to close the funding gap for nature over the next decade. And part of that will involve the use of public money. Part of it will involve the use of philanthropic money. But even more important, it means changing the way public money is spent so that instead of undermining the public good, it supports it. shifting those hundreds of billions of dollars of subsidies that support often highly destructive activity. It means governments using all the levers that are uniquely at their disposal, adjusting the rules so that pollution, degradation, and waste become an unbearable liability, and that the market recognizes the true value of those natural systems that we all depend on for our survival. We have everything we need to make this the decade that we turn things around, and I look forward to continuing to work with all of you in the weeks and months and years ahead to see this through. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lord Goldsmith. If you've joined us a little bit later in our event, let me give you some hashtags so you can share what you hear with the rest of the world on social. Hashtag UNEA, hashtag Post-2020, and hashtag Biodiversity. If we're talking about supporting early implementation, our focus really is on money in this section of our virtual event. Vicki Benjamin is the president and co-founder of Kana Blue Capital. Vicki, really curious about what you have to share with us. Go ahead.
Thank you, Femi, and good morning, good day, everyone. As Lord Goldsmith just mentioned, almost half of the world's GDP is dependent on nature, and there is currently an estimated funding gap of almost $1 trillion a year. What this means, Femi, is that a combined efforts of all the Earth stakeholders, including governmental and non-governmental agencies, conservationists, and philanthropists, have been insufficient to replace the planet's current usage of nature. This is not sustainable, and frankly, the future looks even more daunting. While climate change will lessen the abundance of our resources, a growing, more sophisticated populace will demand more. The time is now for the rebuilding of our infrastructure. The World Economic Forum estimates that up to 18% of all threatened and endangered species are at risk due to climate change and the operations of 3 socioeconomic sectors: food, extractives, and infrastructure. The nature depletive impacts of companies in these industries create financial, reputational, and regulatory risk for their stakeholders. By transforming the traditional operating protocols of participants in these sectors to be more nature positive, we can start to change the current trajectory of nature loss. But how? The finance community, including constituents of the banking, investing, and insurance industries, will be critical to the success of this endeavor. Through capital incentives, financial institutions can support those companies with more nature positive policies and encourage those with fewer to evolve. And thankfully, financial institutions are rapidly becoming engaged. The Pledge for Biodiversity Consortium represents 84 signatories with over 12.6 trillion in assets that are united in their commitment to protect and restore biodiversity through their financing activities, and to compel others to join as well. Kana Blue Capital, of which I'm the co-founder, is one of these organizations of the pledge, and since its inception in 2017 has sought to identify and invest in those companies best managing their nature-based risks. Through bottoms-up research, Kana Blue Capital seeks to identify those companies that are leaders in their sectors in regards to their nature impacts. For instance, those in the agricultural sector that have target date reforestation policies, or others in metals and mining industry that have disaster mitigating tail management procedures. But it is not enough, as we've all heard, to do less harm. We need to do more. Kana Blue Capital also seeks to identify those companies finding opportunities to steward the environment, such as those leading us forward towards a net zero future, like many in the renewable energy industry. The work is not easy, as we've heard from everyone before me, but with the leadership provided by the United Nations, CBD, and TNFD, together with the collective efforts of organizations like the Pledge for Biodiversity and its signatories, and Kana Blue Capital, we believe that we can galvanize the capital markets towards nature positive outcomes, ultimately achieving the mission of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vicki. We will come back to you. In fact, everybody who's spoken so far, you're not dismissed. We have a whole conversation to have. So stand by. As one more speaker I want to bring in, very important speaker, and then our cameras are on, our mics are up, and we're going to talk to each other. All right, collective action, collective discussion. So stand by, everybody. Last chance to get a cup of tea before I make you all come back again. So, wildlife is so important, and we've left it towards the end of our conversation about implementation. So I'm really leaning into Kadu Sabonya, CEO of the African Wildlife Foundation. Early implementation, from your perspective, Kadu, what do you want to tell us?
Thank you, Penny. Ladies and gentlemen, good day to all of you. I thank the organizers for the opportunity. My references are so much based from our experience in Africa, but it's also true of that most of Africa's experience is also true to the global south. The fact that we are unable to meet in this is very encouraging at the time when many countries in Africa are still enduring the effects of the waves of the global pandemic. A pandemic that should not have happened had we had a better relationship with nature. Our survival is impossible without intact and thriving landscape and seascapes. Africa, home to more than 1 billion people, offers the value of nature that has the potential to yield inclusive growth and eradicate poverty. But also Africa, in order for us to move forward, we need to recognize that has the youngest world population, and it's growing rapidly. By sheer numbers alone, the choices, opportunities, and the constraints of young people will continue to play a major role in shaping Africa's development and will determine the biodiversity or Africa the world will have. We need to include them and involve them. There is no question that Africa needs to evolve to meet the needs of these young people. And Africa's need for economic development is non-negotiable. But there is an urgent need for us and the players to recognize that most of our wealth is above the ground. Africa's development pathway, therefore, should be underpinned by the reality that our lives and economies are embedded in nature and biodiversity and ecosystem services. So, the success of the implementation of the Global Biodiversity Framework will be determined mostly by the choices and decisions people make on what economic development, for example, model Africa will have. Choices on what sources for energy Africa will have. Food production measures, how Africa urbanizes, choices on the mode of transport, and girl education. That's where the investment needs to be in order for us to secure biodiversity. The greatest pressure, though, is on biodiversity emergency, a habitat loss, fragmentation, and degradation. These are driven mostly by the choices on economic growth model and food security. These two are the currently defining our relationship with nature, especially on this continent. To this end, it's very important to position the global Southeast development ambitions within the framework of sustainable development goals in a manner, though, that builds community well-being and do so within the limits of the earth. Global Southeast development aspirations must not be limited to addressing today's most pressing conservation and livelihood change challenges, but must proactively anticipate the future. The complexity of a biodiversity-driven economy, I'm suggesting, requires an approach that brings together political, economic, as well as social sectoral discussions. And biodiversity must have a positive place in all these discussions and plans. But to guarantee this place, biodiversity needs to meaningfully contribute to growth, to prosperity of the people. So the next decade is critical and is a tipping point to make us sure we tip it the right way. Thank you.
Thank you, Kadu. I'm going to hold tight with you for a moment. Don't go away. All of the other speakers from both sessions that we've had, words into action, supplementing and supporting this early implementation of the GBF, put your cameras on so that I can see you, so that you can see each other, so that we can do the Q&A with each other. So everybody who's still here in the space, please put your cameras on one by one by one. Very good. Let me start with Kadu because I know your camera and your microphone is on. So I'm wondering about how ready you are. We're talking about a global biodiversity framework that is going to be, it's delayed already, but we will have it this year. How ready are you? Are you ready to hit the ground running? What does that readiness look like?
Absolutely. I mean, we have been existing as an NGO for 60 years. There are so many lessons we are bringing in implementation, lessons we've learned and mistakes we've done, relationships and partners we will have. But there is an elephant in the room. That is the young Africans that we have been able to mobilize in clusters, like Kevin has said, who we partner with on a number of programs that we need to focus on here in Africa, 70% of our populations. But we shouldn't leave their managers behind, and these are women. So there are 4 things we need to do. Help governments to streamline biodiversity as part of their development plans, something already we have tools to do. The second is support rural communities or local implementers to create their own indicators and targets that come from these national government plans and international development plans and frameworks, because it cannot be government to government. The answers are boots on the ground. The third thing is the financing. We need to change the way financing is being done so that the implementers at the local level have access. There is still a challenge for local people to access financing. Financing is mostly going to a lot of international bodies and governments. So we need to find a way of doing that. And the last 4th thing is really the interactions civil society needs to have within this framework. Because so far, what I've been told from civil society is that so far it's government to government.
Let me just bring in Kevin. I saw you nodding as Kadu was talking and he said young people. So I feel like every time someone says young people, you nod anyway. But articulate your nods, spit it out, because I want to know, how ready are we? We've been so delayed with the GBF. Are we ready? Kevin.
Thank you, Femi. I'll start by saying, as young people, we are ready. We are ready. We have assembled ourselves. We are in groups. We are in organizations, movements, networks. We are ready to be engaged, and we are taking action on the ground. We have initiated discussions. We have initiated innovative agendas. We have initiated action that could drive this framework forward. What remains is whether the other stakeholders are ready for us. Are they ready to engage the youth? And
Kevin, are they? Do you feel that? I feel like the young people right now, particularly when it's about the environment, they are pushing the rest of us.
We are pushing, but it seems government, businesses especially, they don't seem to be ready for us. And by large, a great session of the civil society. And as I was saying, I really appreciate organizations that have started this, like the AWF, with very deliberate engagement of young people in the way they are structuring their programs and their strategies, that they are deliberate about the role of young people and including youth in whatever they're planning in the near future, to contribute to the shared vision of living in harmony with nature. We appreciate that the post-2020 is arriving at a critical moment, but it's not too late to engage the groups that matter, the young people. So we as young people, as I mentioned, we are ready, and the other stakeholders don't seem to be ready, But this is a time for us to call them to action and say, hey, look at us, we are here, and we really hope that the post-2020 will be different from, let's say, the IG targets, so that we can all move forward together in a progressive, transformative way, because the injustices and inequalities that brought us into this crisis that we are talking about today will definitely not take us out of it.
I am just going to invite all of the speakers who've been speaking in this event to put on their cameras and be ready. I see Seven and Abigail and Kevin and Neville and Suds and Vicky and Kadu. Any more? If you're there, don't lurk in the shadows. Come right up. I have a question for all of you. I'm just really intrigued. This one comes from Noah Steiner. Seven, do you want to start with this question? And I'd love everyone's take on this. So Noah Steiner says, is it possible to have continuous economic growth and decouple that from environmental destruction? I mean, the answer has got to be yes. But Seven, can you nuance it a little bit for us? Go ahead.
Why does the answer have to be yes? We've created this paradigm in a post-Second World War scenario, and this current form of our economy has persisted for a long time, but it's clear that there's major cracks and it is crumbling. And we have to start looking to how can we revamp our economic system so that it actually serves us, so that it serves true human values like well-being, health, equity, the things that actually matter to human beings. And I see everybody on screen nodding, because we know that measuring our success as a society by GDP, that was never the intention of the GDP in the first place. And yet that has become the major measure of success. So we need to really start addressing our biggest tool. And countries like Scotland and New Zealand are showing how we can do this, how we can start integrating new metrics like well-being, even in our governmental system. So that's really, really important. And I'm glad that you brought that up. But this mindset of endless economic growth, my dad always says, endless growth is the creed of the cancer cell. I mean, and we have to choose something else in this new era. We are not back in the 1940s anymore.
Suds and then Vicky.
Yeah, thank you. Just following on from where Severin left off, I think the whole shift from the whole shareholder to stakeholder is really important in the new construct of business as a force for good. And if you just looked at shareholder value, it was really just financial value. When you start looking at stakeholder value, you're looking at both the environmental and the social and the ecological. So it just changes the bottom line quite significantly. And that has begun to happen. It's probably gaining pace now, but I would say over the last 10 or 12 years is when that inception started. So I think we're on a path. It just needs to be accelerated. And it's the role of businesses like ours. Can we work with national actors and multilateral actors to actually increase the pace of this, to bring technologies in to do that?
That's a good question. Can you answer it, Suds?
Yes.
When we work.
In a simple word, yes. I mean, this is really the principle of SDG 17. I mean, when we are talking about bringing partnerships, it's about bringing the right solutions, accelerating it and scaling it. Totally can be done. And we are seeing it. I'm facing it. I'm experiencing it for myself after having spent a decade in an NGO. I was at the WWF, and I've been doing this now for a couple of years, and I can see the value of that partnership and bringing technology in conjunction with private and public sector to scale.
Vicky, go ahead.
Well, I've done a lot of thinking about this, and to add on to what Sud says and Severin, we have to change our economy from one of nature depletion to one of regeneration. And as I mentioned in my talk, there's three sectors mainly surrounding food, which would be agriculture, land agriculture and fishing, infrastructure, and then extractives, which include energy. And we need to stop letting them take from the planet and nature and we have to change the way they're operating. We have to change, and SUDS is an example right in point. There's a different way of doing business. Business cannot be continuing the way it's going now. And so as a member of the finance industry, and I'm telling you, it's hard to get this going, you know that we can be the fulcrum with which change. If our banks stop lending to, for instance, fossil fuel companies, or at least only lending to their renewable efforts or where they're responsibly drilling, there has to be change in the finance community in order to catapult the rest of the transformations that are necessary. But fundamentally, going back to what Severin said, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right, there has to be a new way of accounting. Capital GDP isn't the way we look at happiness, and dollars isn't the way we look at fulfillment. It's how our communities are, how we're interacting, how healthy the world is, how many elephants that are left, and we need to really think of change our thought of success.
I'm just wondering, Abigail, how does your community see success? Because from an Indigenous perspective, they're not necessarily seeing the land as a source of wealth to be exploited.
Right.
It's to be stewarded.
Yeah. So I guess what I want to also add is that, well, use the word success, but maybe we can also relate it to what is our idea for development, and that can mean different for different peoples. And for Indigenous peoples, it's really very localized and context specific to how we've lived in our territories and in relation to the lands and waters that we have inherited for stewardship. And so what I'd say is on the question about whether we can really go forward with protecting nature, but at the same time continuing an economic model or whatever. In relation to sustainable development, I guess there's no other choice. And while there are a lot of problems, and I also don't want to paint Indigenous communities as very perfect with everything, all services there and etc. But I guess what I just want to point out that we might not have the best economic model as of this moment, and we are trying to transform our actions with the Post-2020 framework in relation to protecting nature. But there are good practices that we can pick up from different places, from different peoples, from Indigenous peoples, from developments, from technology, and from other
Abigail,
sectors.
Can I just pause you and just say,
yes,
what would be a good practice that you would say, shh, I'm giving you this one, I'm sharing this with you, use it? What would that be?
For example, at least in our place in the Philippines, during the pandemic, it was really our agricultural practices, the preserving of our different seeds that really helped in mitigating food security or food issues in our community during the COVID-19 pandemic. So, and this is based on knowledge that that has been passed on from our ancestors, and it may not necessarily be in line with the common idea of what a advanced agricultural system would be, but it worked and it works for us. So I hope that was a very general overview.
I like examples. Neville, I want to share this question with you. See if you can help me unpack it. This one is about the GBF, how they look at managing ecological investments. Will the GBF develop, include, and support ecological investments? Neville, what do you know? What can you share with us on that topic?
Thanks, Remy. Good question, and probably it relates to the previous question as well. So we know that, of course, our economy and our well-being is dependent on the environmental foundations. And so investments in nature, so nature-based solutions to help us address climate change, investments in nature to underpin livelihoods, to create jobs, is part of a growth strategy for societies, and indeed, as many have said, not just the economy, but well-being more broadly. So yes, we need to invest in nature. But as we heard earlier from Carlos Manuel, many of the resources required are already available. And so it's really a matter of aligning resources to ensure they are positive for nature, ensure that our food systems, our finance systems, not undermining the ambitions for nature, which are required for us to sustain our well-being. So yes, we need to invest in nature. New money is certainly required. New resources will certainly be required to deliver effectively on the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. But a large chunk of what needs to be done is using existing resources more effectively and aligning them with the purpose and intent of the global biodiversity framework.
Kadu, are you stretching your finger or asking a question? I
No,
think you're
actually,
asking a question. Go ahead.
I was stretching my hand in order to ask to respond. So, no, thank you very much. I really wanted to jump in your first question, because we also need to be frank that when I hear we need to change, who needs to change? Because, you know, by travel in Africa where I work, in many of the countries, majority of people are living under $1 a day. So when we say we need to change, who needs to change? The way we live, the way we work, the way we produce. I think what we know, I agree with the GDP. That's of course that has been discussed all along. It needs to change, but I think that biggest change needs to be also accompanied by the reward. You know, how do we reward those who conserve? What is the cost of protecting a forest? You know, like in the Congo, the DRC, that is almost 3/4 of forest. It's only rewarded by timber, by mining, but there's no reward within the economic system we have developed to reward those who conserve, or governments who conserve. And when we say people need to change the way, I think the question you asked, what is one thing we can suggest? For Africa, I think I would say it's Ubuntu. It's the idea that I am because of you. Yeah. It's the idea that you are because of me. It's not the we that takes it all. It's the society, it's the community, it's the well-being of all of us.
Do you know, speakers, what struck me, because we split the session into two parts, was the putting words into action part, because we've just been speaking for almost 90 minutes. We haven't been acting at all. I would love, in a sentence, your best advice for how words turn into action. How do you do that? How do you do that in your experience, in your in where you come from, bringing your expertise to this conversation? How do you turn words into action, Kevin?
Yeah, thank you, Femi.
You said thank you like, why did you ask me? It's a sentence. Don't overthink it. Go ahead.
Yeah, as I mentioned, and as various speakers have mentioned, the Post-2020 is preaching about transformative change, but we need to realize the boundaries through which the transformative change must happen. So we need to address the key drivers of biodiversity loss, and they're all there. I mean, we're talking about pollution, we're talking about sectorial drivers. So
right, I'm going to leave it as address the key drivers. That's how you turn the words into action. Vicki.
Yeah. As I think we all need to lead and continue leading efforts in our respective groups as far as conservationist, business leaders, philanthropic entities, and try to get the rest of the world motivated and involved in our own sectors. But being out there and talking and speaking, because at least in the US, there's not a lot of understanding of this issue.
Yeah, Neville.
Yeah, I think leadership and political will, and underpinning that, transparency and accountability need to be strengthened.
Abigail.
I think they already mentioned a lot of good points, but I guess it's each one of us should think of this as our responsibility as not separate from nature, but as part of nature and the whole ecosystem.
Collective action, Suds.
I think it's raise the right capital, scale the technology, and partner across sectors.
Kadu.
I think it's recognition of others, their voices, their knowledge, and meeting them where they are in order for us to own the solutions altogether.
7. It's the 30th anniversary of you telling us we need to act. And here I am asking you again, how do you turn those words into action?
Well, we've heard so many good ideas and different perspectives that are so important. And I really think that, you know, us coming together and really grappling with these and really listening to each other is part of how we have to keep trying. One thing that we all have to keep in mind is we have to be vigilant about the solutions and make sure that the solutions that become implemented are not the same, just the same patterns and from the same mindset that got us into this mess. And one example I'm thinking of is nature-based solutions, which are having uptake. We have to make sure they're not a neo-colonial land grab against Indigenous peoples and marginalized communities. So we have to be vigilant. But I think right now, 30 years after Rio, we are at this incredible moment post-pandemic. The whole world is poised. We don't know what the new era is, but truly, I feel there's a window where the public governments, we're ready to recognize we can't keep on with business as usual. We're not going to go back to 2019. So there is a chance to do something really different, and we have to seize that chance in every way we can on a personal and an influential level.
Thank you, speakers, for spending 90 minutes, well, actually 85 minutes with us. I've got a few more minutes just to wrap up. Really appreciate your insights and sharing your advice for us as a global community about how we create a post-2020 global biodiversity framework and then implement it. Thank you very much. So, a lot of responsibility wrapping up this event. It does not go to me. It goes to the co-chairs of WG 2020. We start with Basil van Harve. Basil, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Femi. It's a pleasure to be able to join you, and I was really interested in hearing the many voices that we heard this morning. I'll try to start with a summary, and as usual, Francis will correct me and compliment where I fail, and that's the way we work together. What I heard is a real desire to have, on one side, ambition, but also be realistic and mindful of the development needs. I heard that will not work if it's not complemented on one side by a robust planning, reporting, and review system that will tell us whether we're making a difference or not. And then I heard about the need for resources and the need to put our money where our hearts and our voice has been. So all that, those three aspect and three perspective, is done within a context where our action should be respecting the right of people, particularly Indigenous people and local communities. The other side is a very clear message that change is possible, and we've heard that, but also change is necessary, both in the way we act and how we're considering our future. So it was very interesting to see the diversity of the message. It was very interesting that basically the speakers we've seen is an embodiment of what we're trying to do, which is a framework for all. So I will leave you with those words and pass it on to Francis. Francis, over to you.
Thank you, Basil. I'll try to keep within the minutes we're given, and thank you for those remarks. Moderator, we have had a lot. This discussion really gives us, much more energy to keep going. But we've heard about the importance of biodiversity and ecosystem services it provides, but also heard that biodiversity itself, we don't even know in totality how to manage it in some instances. it is beyond sometimes our understanding. So if we lose it, if we just keep degrading biodiversity, we may not be able to actually take it back to what it was. So therefore, the need to make sure that we conserve biodiversity. But I also heard that adopting the framework is just the beginning, which is very true. We are now thinking of adopting the framework, but the journey for implementation will just start. But I want to make a conclusion here that we really need to look at one thing, that when it comes to implementation, it will not be word implement, implement, implement. The resources to implement must be there. The mistakes we made in the strategic plan for biodiversity 2011-2020 was that it was poorly funded, it was poorly implemented, and people almost forgot that there was even a strategic plan of that nature. This is not something we should bring forward in post-2020. So we have to do things differently if we are going to see progress. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Francis Ogwo and Basil van Haaf. And thank you speakers. This session has been about implementing the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Thank you for your questions and for your attention. This session is now closed.